So hello and welcome to the Jefferson Educational Society's digital programming. I'm Ben Spagan and I'm the Vice President at the Jefferson and am a contributing editor at the Erie Reader. Joining me in conversation is Miss Caitlin Welsh, and she is here to discuss food security during the COVID-19 pandemic, U.S. and global perspectives. And there are few as qualified as today's speaker to speak on today's issue. As the director of the Global Food Security Program at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, CSIS, Ms. Welsh provides insights and policy solutions to global food security challenges. She brings over a decade of U.S. government experience to this role, having served most recently in the National Security Council and the National Economic Council as Director of Global Economic Engagement, where she coordinated U.S. policy in the G7 and G20 summits. Now, prior to the White House, Ms. Welsh spent over 7 years in the Department of State's Office of Global Food Security, including as its acting director, offering guidance to the Secretary of State on global food security. Now, as a presidential management fellow, Ms. Welsh oversaw a portfolio of agriculture-related grants at the U.S. African Development Foundation. She's lived and worked in Morocco as a Peace Corps volunteer, and she last joined the Jefferson Educational Society in April of 2020. Her analysis since then has been featured by The Economist, Foreign Policy, BBC, Forbes, and other outlets. She received her bachelor's degree at the University of Virginia and her master's degree from Columbia University's School of International Public Affairs, speaks both Arabic and French, and she hails from Erie, Pennsylvania. So from food security in the U.S. broadly to the impact of specific communities, to a look at global conditions, international supply chains, potential famines, and food shortages, Ms. Welsh will offer a tour de horizon of the impact of COVID-19 pandemic. Looking back to her last digital program with us in April, to where conditions stand now, to estimations of where we're headed through the fall and through the summer and into the fall. Now, since this program is first airing live on the Jefferson's Facebook page, we're going to work our way through as many questions from you, the viewers, as we can as we host this event. If you have a question, just leave it in the comment section below and we'll do our best to get to those. If you happen to be watching a later broadcast of this event, still feel free to send us questions and we're going to do our best to get them along to Ms. Welsh. And of course, for more information about upcoming Jefferson Educational Society programs and publications, please do visit our website, jeserie.org. Be sure to like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter and Instagram, and subscribe to our YouTube channel. Miss Caitlin Welsh, thanks for joining me again for a digital program.
Thank you so much, Ben. Thanks for having me back.
So, Caitlin, first question to get us started here. Since we last spoke in April, the overall story of food security, and I know I'm asking you to paint with the broadest of brushes here, just to get a sense of where we've gone from April to mid-July as we sit here, July 21st now. The overall story of food security, has it been, please choose one of the following: better than expected, as expected, worse than expected?
I think I'll choose D, actually, which is unexpected. So I think we've had some unexpected disruptions to food systems in the U.S. and abroad, which I'll be happy to get into.
So I love the creative answer, and I think maybe the best way to start unpacking that is to ask you to start with global hunger trends, both short and long term, to get an idea of where we had been, maybe how the pandemic's affecting us, and where we might stand to go.
Okay, great. That's a great question, and I want to say it's perfect timing to be asking that question right now. 5 years ago, all member states of the UN agreed to a set of goals having to do with sustainable development. And the goal about global hunger was to eliminate hunger by 2030. So once a year, the UN puts out a report that tracks progress against that commitment. And that report was released just 1 week ago. So a week ago today, actually, which is what I mean by perfect timing to be talking about this issue. And what that report says, it talks about essentially chronic hunger. And it gives us a couple of important figures. One is that global hunger has increased this year over last year in terms of chronic hunger. Not only that, but it's been increasing. We actually thought it had been increasing from 2018 on. They looked back and revised data and found that global hunger has been actually increasing from 2014 and on, which is a worse picture than we expected. And also that we're projected not to meet our target of eliminating hunger by 2030. And there's a couple of measurements they use to look at that, but essentially we're looking at the number of chronically undernourished people in the world is 690 million. So that's one important figure. Again, that's looking at long-term hunger. Now, because of the pandemic, we're seeing spikes in essentially short-term hunger and acute food insecurity. And those spikes happen because of job losses, because of decreases in income and things like that. And it's the World Food Program that estimates that. They're estimating this year that there will be that 270 million people are susceptible to experiencing food insecurity through these spikes. And that's an increase of 80% over last year's figure. So overall, the global trends are not looking good.
And I want to get back to some of those specifics, and I do want to talk about the revelation of where we've come since 2014 in a bit. But how does the U.S. stack up against what we're seeing globally?
Yeah. So in the U.S., the trends are not going in the right direction. That's not unexpected given the economic downturn we're experiencing right now. Every 2 years, the USDA puts out its nationwide analysis of food insecurity. We had that 2 years ago. We haven't had a nationwide analysis by USDA during the pandemic, but we do have analyses of data that's coming through CDC and through other departments and agencies. And what that's showing is that we're experiencing food insecurity that's on par with what we experienced in the Great Recession. But what we do have is historic highs in food insecurity among children. And so what we knew, and this data is being updated almost weekly, what we knew most recently was that households with children were experiencing food insecurity at the highest rates on record. And now we know it's actually the children themselves. We're seeing food insecurity among children themselves at the highest rates on record. And that's right now, according to the latest data, that's about 14 million children in the United States experiencing food insecurity.
So you mentioned the USDA data there. Is it we don't have it because of the pandemic? We're just not timed to have it. The USDA is facing some other challenge. Just for those curious about why we don't have that set of metric just yet, or when we might get it.
Yeah, I think actually I don't know the answer to that question. I do know that it's often the fact that these large agencies will gather data for a large swath of the population, and the analyses will be about a year behind. So the UN data that I was just mentioning, that data is actually for 2019. So in 2019, it was 690 million people food insecure. Next year, we'll have the data for 2020. Put my money on the fact that it's going to be greater than 690 million. But it's not uncommon to have data for large swaths of the population be lagged by a year or so.
So we've already got an audience question coming in that came in right now to me, wondering why we're seeing that large population be the children that are actually experiencing food insecurity. What has changed for them?
Yeah, my guess is two things. One, it could be the timing. It could be because this is happening when schools are not in session. Now, even if this were fall or spring, because we're in the pandemic, children might not be in school in any case, but because schools play an important role in our social safety net providing meals to students, that could be one reason, because it's summertime. Traditionally in the United States, hunger does spike in the summertime, and there are relief programs to address that. The other reason, it could simply be the depth of the economic downturn we're experiencing. Oftentimes when a household experiences food insecurity, adults can shield the children from food insecurity. So they can provide meals to children, but then the adults themselves can reduce their food intake. But right now, because of the depth of the recession, adults are unable to shield children from that. So that's why we're seeing this spike.
Well, and you mentioned the critical role that schools play in providing meals for those who may not be getting them, sometimes 2 meals a day, breakfast and lunch, where they're not getting that in the household. And on top of that, the list of disruptions to the U.S. food systems because of the pandemic certainly isn't short. So from your perspective, I'd like to walk through a couple of different points, and I want to start with jobs and sales loss in the restaurant industry, where we're seeing that nationwide happen. So tell us a little bit about what you're seeing from your vantage point there.
Yeah, absolutely. So happy to walk through these disruptions, as I mentioned, a lot of which were unexpected. First of all, in the restaurant and food service industry, this was the industry that was the one industry hardest hit by job losses. They've lost 6 million jobs. They did lose 6 million jobs in March and April, and they lost a total of $80 billion in sales. And that's because of sudden closure of restaurants, not just restaurants, but also imagine cafeterias at universities, food outlets at sports arenas, et cetera. So sudden closure led to that loss in sales. And then something that I want to back up and just draw some relationships related to that. You have on-farm production impacts. So when these markets fall off, all of a sudden the producers who are getting ready to sell food to restaurants and universities and sports arenas, et cetera, all of a sudden they have no markets for their produce. And that's why one of the starkest images we were seeing during this spring was when farmers were being forced to plow under their harvests, when ranchers were being forced to euthanize their animals. And so we had, even by the end of April, associations estimating that there were $5 billion worth of losses in fruits and vegetable sales. And then I have not seen one number to just to put together all the loss of animals, but I saw one estimate that it's going to be in the millions of animals that were euthanized because they were unable to be processed because of plant shutdowns.
And I can't just gloss over that when you said 5 billion, that's with a B, and you said 80 billion in loss to the restaurant industry. Just looking at the total hit of what that looks like. And I've got to imagine too the challenges on a state by state basis. As we're seeing, governors lead, rather than a federal response that's uniform in response, perhaps. Where certain states are able to open more quickly, and then maybe have to walk back some of those openings and change, where restaurants get a chance to be open for a month, if not just a few weeks, and then have to adjust. But with farms, I don't want to lose sense of processing plants too, and the importance of the impact of COVID-19 on processing plants. What are you seeing there?
Yeah. Real quick on the restaurant industry, you're right about the closures and then reopenings and then closings and reopenings. Right now, latest data is that we've hired back almost half of those 6 million jobs that were lost, but not quite half. But then I don't know what we'll see in the next iteration once we've seen some of the closures being reflected again. But to your question on meat processing plants, workers in food systems across the United States have proven to be among the most vulnerable. They're the most essential, and they're also among the most vulnerable, just because of the close contact with other people that their jobs require. So think about workers in grocery stores. Think about people that are delivering your food orders to your home, and then people who are working in meat processing plants, for example. And it's meat processing plants that are particularly hard hit. That's been in the news a lot. This has not been limited to a handful of states. It's about 30 states, maybe more than 30 states, that have seen outbreaks at meat processing plants. Latest data is that there have been over 43,000 cases of COVID tied to meat processing plants, and almost 150 deaths tied to those.
I mean, I think that's one of the things that perhaps a large swath of the nation may not have been aware of before, or may not have been thinking of, is the density of that supply chain. How many people touch your food before it gets from where it originated to your table or to your refrigerator? How many people are in between there? One of the stops it makes along the way is the grocery store, and we're seeing prices fluctuate there. Tell us about the spikes you're seeing. What's holding stable? What do you see is happening in grocery stores in regards to prices?
Yeah. I think you just touched on it. We're seeing consistent elevation in prices. The only product whose price has really spiked is beef. That's a 20% increase in the price of beef over the past 3 months, which is just blows any increase out of the water. I mean, that's clearly the highest we've ever seen. Apart from that, we've seen steady upticks in prices, but nothing like beef. But what we can expect is what I wouldn't be surprised to see is volatility in prices of certain things. Maybe a spike in price of one item for a disruption, for some type of disruption, but then that levels out. So I think that, and in fact, I think that this echoes what USDA is saying, is that we'll probably see some increases, but relatively steady prices, but we might see volatility in prices.
Well, I think that spike in meat prices really affirms your initial answer there of the unexpected, that we didn't know where this was headed, because when we talked back in April, we thought that was going to be a relatively stable portion of the food supply chain, the food industry, food security. We didn't see that coming. And it's hard to ask anybody to have a crystal ball to say what's next. And I think too, that's part of the challenging aspect of what we're living through is because if we do target something, what's next, we're going to see a flood on the market of people running out to grocery stores and trying to stock up, getting deep freezers and trying to be prepared for when that's going. Other surges and challenges that I think we're seeing nationwide that we value your input and perspective on is the role of food banks and the surge we're seeing there as we're looking at the compounding issues of the effects of the pandemic of folks who are either unemployed now or temporarily employed or caught in that yo-yo of back and forth, not knowing what their future holds. We see more demand on food banks. Walk us through what that looks like right now.
Yeah, sure. Across the board, Feeding America, which is the umbrella organization over all food banks in our country, has seen a 70% increase in demand nationwide. And 40% of customers at food banks right now are people who had never gone to food banks before the pandemic. One thing to put this into perspective, the food bank that serves the Washington, D.C. area, it's called the Capital Area Food Bank, they were unable to procure food from normal sources. So generally they'll get donations from grocery stores, excess product they couldn't sell. Well, we don't have that anymore because most people a lot more people are shopping at grocery stores. They were getting food from donations. Well, there's not as many food drives just because of social distancing. So the Capital Area Food Bank was forced to purchase food to meet the region's demands. In April, they purchased 100 semi-trucks worth of food to meet regional demand in the month of April. And that amount was 3 times the amount they had purchased in all of 2019 combined. So we're seeing huge surges in demand at food banks. And one thing that you're hearing operators say is that this is meant to be a stopgap. This is not meant to be a long-term program to meet long-term needs. And that's where our social safety net systems, that's where SNAP and WIC come into play. And other forms of benefits. For every 1 meal that a food bank provides in the United States, SNAP provides 9. And so that's why you see a lot of people who are involved in food bank administration saying, I'm glad that people are donating money here, but please focus your efforts also on SNAP and WIC and other programs.
So just real quickly for anybody tuning in that may not have a familiarity with SNAP or WIC and how those benefits have worked in the past and how they're a short-term measure right now, could you just unpack that a little bit?
Sure. SNAP is essentially what we used to call food stamps. It's supplemental nutrition program for supplemental nutrition assistance program is what SNAP stands for. WIC is SNAP for women, infants, and children. And right now, actually, probably as we speak, there's negotiations going on about what types of increases we could see to these programs in the next relief package. We have seen increases both in the maximum benefits to families in the past relief packages. There have been different types of increases. Those have been appreciated by advocacy organizations and of course by people who benefit from them. But everyone's also saying, thanks for doing this, but this is not nearly enough to match the depth and the duration of this economic downturn. So the House is proposing, they have a set of proposals about, again, increasing maximum benefit, increasing the duration of these things for not just this pandemic, but for a couple of years down the line. So that the House is very much in support of this, Senate not as much right now. Unfortunately, this really falls along partisan lines. You do have over 2,500 hunger-related organizations that have signed a letter in support of the House proposals.
And so one of the things I have to imagine has remained the same since the last time we talked was we discussed the difference between dropping food off at food banks versus if you can make a contribution, doing that monetarily and making that contribution. Is that still the call, or is it at this point, if you have extra things in your pantry, drop them off, help food banks? I know people out there have to be wondering, if I can and I'm able, how do I help, and how do I help effectively?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'm not exactly sure about what protocols food banks are following right now. I would say though, take a look at whatever your local food bank or food pantry is asking. If you have extra food to provide, then I think that they would probably welcome that. What I would say is to take a look at how your local representative is planning to vote on the next relief package and on provisions on SNAP and WIC and provisions having to do with food security generally for Americans. And I would encourage your local representative to vote to expand SNAP and WIC benefits. I think that, again, that's the much more effective in the longer term intervention.
So Caitlin, we touched on it earlier, and I don't want to lose sight of it, the vulnerability amongst the workers in the food industry, and just kind of unpacking that supply chain, even just basically, and now we've become more aware of how many stops our food makes, how many people make our food happen, how essential those workers are. So if you could just touch a little bit on the vulnerability, how many people we're seeing in interactions, and how that's improved or gotten worse, is more threatened since the last time we talked in April, and where you see that headed when it comes to a critical link in that supply chain, the workers.
Yeah, if anything, I think that we're just more aware right now of the vulnerabilities across food industries. I don't know that safeguards have made workers that much safer. I think there's more attention on this. I've seen some media outlets putting forward perhaps exposés about how perhaps there are processing plants that might be trying to get around those protocols. I don't want to cite anything myself, but generally speaking, I think that there's just more scrutiny on this issue, which I hope leads to better safety for workers in the food system. I do want to touch on something, Ben. When you talked about the meat supply chain and increases in prices in beef, I really do think it's almost amusing that I also went back to the last talk that I did with you, and where I said, based on USDA's projections, that meat supply chains would be stable. That there's been fluctuations in prices, but you can expect stability out of the meat supply chain in the United States. And it wasn't weeks, maybe even days after that you started seeing high rates of COVID at meat plants, and then all the down chain reactions from that. And I think it's important to note that it was worker vulnerability that caused the meat supply chain to essentially grind to a halt. And I think obviously it's important for us to keep an eye to that for moral and ethical reasons. Also, just because of the importance of this to keeping our supply chains running in the United States.
Well, I think that's maybe serves as a good example of, we can make sound estimations on where we're headed and what trends look like based on what we have now, data we have now, observations we have now. But if COVID's taught us anything, is how quickly things can shift and pivot. And so we're seeing that in food security, and elsewhere. So we're seeing that here of just the volatility of one day we might think prices are going to hold and they're going to remain steady. And it takes just a few instances to really alter that course and to change it. So, Caitlin, I want to draw on your policy expert knowledge here and say, when it comes to looking at proposals to address food insecurity, what are we seeing globally? Let's start there. And then what are we seeing domestically?
Yeah, sure. To touch on your point on uncertainty, Ben, I totally agree. I like to point out the USDA has said recently that we're dealing with an unprecedented crisis and there are many unknowns that could shape the situation. So essentially just that caveat over the predictions that they give. And the UN, in this report that I mentioned that was released a week ago today, has said that it's important to recognize that any assessment at this stage is subject to a high degree of uncertainty and could be interpreted with caution, and should be interpreted with caution, rather. So exactly, dealing with lots of uncertainties. And when it comes to looking at policies to address food insecurity globally, one thing that I think is that is getting more scrutiny, that should be getting more scrutiny right now, is the importance of a diet that's with high nutritional value. Now, the way that the UN used to measure food insecurity was that if someone could access a diet that just met their basic energy needs, then they weren't hungry. Then they were food secure. Now, that could mean a diet of straight rice the whole day, of cassava the whole day. Which of course that might keep you from being hungry, but that's not going to help you. It's not going to meet your nutrient needs. And so what the UN did is they looked at three types of diets: the diet that's just going to meet your energy needs, a diet that's going to provide some of your nutritional needs, and then a diet that's a healthy diet. And they found, as released last week, that the cost of even the mid-level diet was higher than the international poverty line per day. So you're considered to be living in poverty if you live on $1.90 or less per day. The cost of this middle diet was between $2 and $3. So essentially one of the main areas of policy discussion is how do we make diets healthier and how do we make them more affordable for people around the world? So that's one thing. I think another thing another area of focus for us right now is simply looking at ways to safeguard incomes, because when I mentioned that the World Food Program is estimating that 270 million people are susceptible to acute food insecurity this year, that's because of estimates and job losses that the International Labor Organization provided. It's because of reductions in remittances that the World Bank has estimated. Now, remittances it's when someone works in one country and sends that money to another country, sends that money to their family back home. So essentially, it's food security is not going to improve until we see recovery in our economy as a whole.
So, Kate, I'm glad you brought up WFP, because somebody in our audience has a question specific to that, and I think that's looking at both the economy and the impact of food security. They write, hunger threatens to soar to devastating levels in 25 countries in the coming months due to the impact of the global COVID-19 pandemic. The World Food Program, WFP, and the Food and Agriculture Organization, FAO, are warning. How long, this is the question, how long can the world continue its fight against COVID without causing massive famines?
I think this is $1 million question. This is one question that I've talked to a number of different reporters about. There's a balance that countries have to find between lockdowns that prevent the spread of the virus, but also I guess not having lockdowns that allow people to move around and participate in the economy, which then safeguards incomes and prevents famines from happening. And I've had people ask me, what's the solution? And I think that it's just the $1 million question that every country has to answer for itself. Obviously in our own country, state by state in our own country, we're seeing that question answered differently. But again, there is no one answer to that question. Governments are dealing with competing public policy priorities right now between public health, food security, and the economy.
And it's a devastating juggling act to ask leadership to take on and to ask people just to bear in terms of trying to navigate that. You mentioned domestically, so I want to go back there and look at policy, because it is state to state to state, and maybe you want to break it down by region. Maybe there's a way to cluster states, but what is policy looking like in terms of getting us through this? Smart policy that's working, or policy that's been tried and it doesn't work and we need to look further beyond that? What are we seeing domestically, Caitlin?
Yeah, well, I guess we're seeing the conversation play out in real time. So again, it's discussions around the next relief package. The way that those discussions play out is going to determine levels of benefits of SNAP and WIC in our own social safety net system. Also, right now, there's evaluation happening of programs that have been set up during the pandemic, like the food box program. There's a hearing that was happening about that this afternoon, could be ongoing. Just scrutiny over the efficacy of that program. I won't break it down region by region. I will say though, it's just nationwide increases across SNAP and WIC that are I think the most important conversations happening on a domestic level.
So I think if from an American vantage point, we've got to wonder how the rest of the world is looking at us. Are they looking at us as a leader, leading through crisis, managing through crisis even, or is there a skeptical eye? What is it from your global perspective? What are other countries saying when they take a look at the United States right now and how we're handling this?
Sure, absolutely. So, well, I will start at looking at global food security. So the United States has been seen as a leader in global food security for a really long time. And we've gotten bipartisan support for this for a very long time. The last time there was a global food crisis was 2007, 2008. And there was a huge increase in funding for global food security that started at the end of George W. Bush's term, that was continued by the Obama administration in the first year. So that was a perfect example of Republican Democrat administrations carrying that forward. We have been the greatest donor, the country that's given the most for global food security for a long time. So we've for a long time been seen as leaders in this. Anecdotally, as I've been talking to some press over the past few months, some questions that I'm getting are from people based in other countries saying, we see on the news lines at food banks that are miles long. We never thought this was possible in your country. Explain what's happening. So I think that I think that our own leadership globally is going to be tied to how we address food insecurity domestically. And right now we're choosing not to be leaders to the extent that we were in the past on global food issues. But in the immediate term, we really need to be looking domestically at our own house.
And I can attest to that, having grown up in southwestern Pennsylvania, I remember seeing national news of a line of cars trying to get to a food bank in the greater Pittsburgh area around Washington County. So we're seeing that, and that's something, that's being broadcast nationally here, and I think it'd be remiss of us not to think that internationally people are curious about that as well. I've got to put you on the spot for an audience question here. Is there a country that's getting it right now? And that's the couching it, right now, because we know things are going to change, and so I think that's what makes that a tough question, is who's getting it right now, because I don't even want to say we're in the eye of the storm. We don't know how long the storm's going to be.
That's a great question. I don't know. I'd love to answer that question though, so perhaps I can follow up with an answer to that question.
You've already booked your third program. I love it. You're going to be back again. So one of the things I've taken note of, so your title is Global Food Security. You work global food security, yet we're seeing CSIS increase its support for domestic study and coverage. So they're plugging in. Your think tank is now committing resources to study food security domestically. It might seem obvious, given what you're covered, but why is that so critical now, if I have to ask that basic question?
Yeah, I think that's an excellent question. I think the main reason is one that I just mentioned, which is it has to do with our leadership globally. And we want to be seen as leaders. We have the most developed agricultural systems in the world in our country. We want to be leaders in this area. And again, our own leadership is being eroded when other countries are seeing us unable to deal with our own challenges. They're seeing, again, lines at food banks. They're seeing what's happening in our meat processing plants. I can go on, but we are making headlines for the wrong reasons in other countries, and we need to reverse that trend as we become leaders in this area, or global leaders again in this area. And the second issue is that these, just like other global issues, climate change, energy security, et cetera, these things don't stop at our own borders. So, for example, I did an event recently where we talked about the impact of COVID-19 on migration and migration patterns, and on the impact of those things on food security. Those things are by nature international. They affect the United States, all of our neighbors. These problems, they're global and they affect the United States. So it makes sense to integrate domestic with international.
So with that study, if you had to give us the 3,000-foot takeaway, what is the takeaway right now on the migration patterns and the impact of COVID-19?
Yeah, lots of ways to look at that, but one is that there could be a shortfall in migrant labor that are involved in high work intensity crops. So, for example, that's not grains; those are low intensity, don't require a lot of labor, but it's fruits and vegetables. One example is that in Europe, they could be seeing a shortfall of 1 million laborers working in their on farms for fruits and vegetables. And then it's also really important to look at the vulnerability of migrant workers. They often have access to the least amount of protection, just as we were talking about food worker vulnerability before. So,
I've got to think that that's going to be a challenge for us. The agricultural system in the United States relies on migrant workers, and if we're not allowed to move back and forth, or people don't want to move back and forth, or people feel like they're not safe moving back and forth, that's going to be a huge hit to our system here.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that we have done a good job extending the H-2A visa, which is the one for temporary agricultural workers. So I don't think that we're at an immediate risk of a shortfall of labor. And I think that one thing that doesn't get coverage is the work that we do to safeguard workers in the agricultural system. So I was talking with someone in the Department of Labor who mentioned that her office does something like 1,100 visits to farms around the country per year to make sure that they're paying laborers enough. They're helping recover millions of dollars in wages for farm workers who aren't being paid enough. So there are protections that are being put in place, thankfully.
So we talked about the disruptions to the U.S. food system because of the COVID-19 pandemic. Aside from disruptions, there are disparities, and COVID-19 is shining a light in various corners. One of those, for instance, I can't help but think of is the fact that in Erie, We know that Black residents comprise 7% of the county's overall population, yet the last data I saw, it's more than a third of the positive cases. And so there is a clear disparity there. But Erie isn't the anomaly. It's not like that's just happening in Erie. Tell us about the racial disparities when it comes to food security, particularly in light of the impact of COVID-19.
Yeah, we're taking a look at this, and we're looking at this through a food security lens. So apart from age, the factor that is most important to determine if someone who has fallen ill from the virus dies from the virus is obesity. And you have high rates of non-communicable diseases like obesity, heart disease, other non-communicable diseases, much higher rates among non-white populations in the United States. And that often has to do with access to nutritious diets. So we're looking at access by African American and other communities. I think that Washington, D.C. is a perfect case study of low access to nutritious food. In the community east of the Anacostia River in Washington, D.C., predominantly African American, there are about 150,000 people. The number of full service grocery stores in that community is 3. So it's easy to tie access to food to health outcomes, and then those underlying health conditions as they relate to morbidity and mortality from COVID-19.
And so one of the things that I think is important to note sometimes too, when the term food deserts has become so popular that now we have a sense of where there is a lack of access to food, but food apartheid matters too, in terms of that access. And while we do see people say, well, there's a convenience store and it's selling apples by the apple rather than by the bag, or one banana at a time. We're seeing the cost rates be markedly different, where it might be 25 cents for an apple or $1 for an apple, just one item, rather than being able to walk into a grocery store and purchase many more of those at a lower cost, but it's access to get to that grocery store. But for those looking at the importance of unpacking the conversation around food deserts, because I've got a question here about understanding food deserts versus food apartheids. Can you speak to the importance of just the casual person understanding the importance of that in their own community? You use DC as an example, but tell us why that really matters.
Yeah, sure. My sense is that the conversation is shifting away from food deserts to using this term food apartheid, deserts being things that occur in nature. Food, lack of access to food is not something that has to be natural. It happens because of generational lack of investment in certain communities across the board. I think it's important to look at for any number of reasons. I think the one thing that I do want to highlight is that there's no one silver bullet to this. I am really, really glad that this issue is getting a lot more scrutiny right now. We've always had higher rates of non-communicable diseases among certain communities, higher rates of food insecurity among certain communities. And we just used to take that for granted. And I've sensed a shift in that conversation over the past few months. And I'm really glad to see that. And that's why we're going to be focusing through some of our work on looking at racial disparities and food security outcomes in the United States. We just published an essay on that last week. But to my point about there being no one silver bullet, it's a whole host of interventions that have to happen. It's intervention in public transportation to make access to grocery stores easier. It's things that make investments in grocery stores more attractive for companies themselves. Lots of things on and on. But again, there's no one silver bullet.
So, Caitlin, one of the things you mentioned early in this talk was the year 2014, and looking at trends that started then that perhaps we hadn't been aware of or just weren't aware of, as we're starting to try to wrestle with what's happening right now. Walk us back 6 years to 2014, what we started seeing then and why that matters right now.
Yeah, sure. Well, so I think that one thing that's really important is to note that I'm not sure if I mentioned this at the beginning, but it's a revision in our understanding based on revised data that shows that hunger started to get worse from 2014 on. We used to think that it started getting worse in 2018. And that was because of impacts we were seeing from climate change, increased levels of conflicts in different parts of the world. But it's a new story now, as of last week, that it actually started getting worse in 2014. I'm guessing that's because of an uptick in conflict. That's when we started seeing civil war at the level at extreme levels in Syria, for example. So that's probably one thing that led to that number increasing then. But again, it's a worse story than we actually thought, that it's been getting bad for the last 6 years.
So, Caitlin, as we're winding up here, just a few last questions. One of those I have to ask: if somebody's watching this right now who identifies as being food insecure and has questions, but doesn't know where to start, where do we point them? How do we get them connected to resources? What's a good place for them to start locally? What's a good place? How can we help, essentially? Where do we point people? How do we get information to the hands of those who need it?
Yeah, I know that that on a national level, I know that there are resources that I have seen by, for example, by the FDA saying, if you are experiencing food insecurity, then go to X, Y, and Z sources. I think those are going to differ community by community. And I would say, if you are experiencing food insecurity in your community, I think that your local food pantry, or if you're around a food bank, is going to have their finger on the pulse of resources in your own community. So that's where I would go for immediate information. But again, I think that it's hopefully immediate relief can come from food banks and food pantries, but SNAP and WIC are longer term solutions. There are outlets out there that are helping people to enroll in SNAP and WIC benefits, because the enrollment process is not always straightforward. So I encourage people to look for those outlets as well.
And we'll work to do our best to put some information in the comment section, plug people in Erie, Pennsylvania, to Second Harvest Food Bank, the Erie City Mission, places like that, where we can point in the right direction. But again, I continue to hear you, Caitlin, with the importance of understanding SNAP and WIC and the expansions there, and making sure people get a chance to connect to those resources. So conversely, on the other side of the coin, somebody's watching this, who's at home with a full cupboard and already has their next trip to the grocery store planned, but wants to help. Where do we point them?
Yeah, I think you can. Again, I encourage you to look at the policies that your own local food bank or food pantry is following. I also just encourage people to become creative and to make use of all the food in their house right now. I mentioned huge amounts of food loss that were happening as a result of the pandemic. In the United States, by far, most food that's lost in the United States happens between markets and homes, mainly in homes, because people they prepare food and don't eat it and just toss it out. It's the number one product thrown most often in landfills in every state across the country. So I think I would just encourage people to, when they cook food at home, which almost everyone is doing more frequently these days, make sure you make use of all that food.
Well, I can't remember the poundage offhand, but I remember talking about that prior, of the average pounds per person that is actually wasted in the United States, in terms of what we bring home and then don't use and turn around and toss it into a trash bag and take it out to the curb, and we forget about it and don't think about it, while we have a global crisis. It's a crisis here in our own country, but it's a global crisis as well. Caitlin, we've got one more question coming in from our audience, and I'm going to get that for you right now. What can people do? What can people do who aren't food insecure to help those, aside from donating to food banks? Are there any places you point them? I think it's very similar to what we were just talking about, but aside from the food banks, are there ways to volunteer that you see nationally? I know you mentioned earlier Feeding America as a national organization. Ways they can plug into their community that you see are successful.
Yeah, I think, again, it's going to differ community by community, but I think that one thing people can do as citizens is to educate ourselves about the importance of SNAP and WIC benefits and other types of benefits. Again, for every one, I don't know if I mentioned this, for every one meal provided by a food bank, SNAP and WIC benefits provide 9 meals. Again, these are the more sustainable. These are things that are going to have the more impact than food banks. These things are the things that food bank operators say, no, thank you for your donations. Please keep those coming, but turn your attention to our government-run programs. The conversation has become incredibly politicized. It wasn't always this way, and I think the more educated our population is, the more we can encourage our own representatives to make the right decisions.
So if I had to ask you to sum it up, the most important takeaways right now, knowing that things could change, because the last time we talked, things changed. Just a few days later, we're talking about different meat prices than what we were talking about, and that being impacted by the pandemic. But right now, as people are pardon the pun, digesting this, taking it in, ruminating on it, and thinking about food insecurity, food security here in the United States, but also abroad, internationally? What are the most important things for people to hold on to right now, Caitlin?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think the importance of educating yourselves about trends that are happening globally and domestically, but also taking a look at your own consumption patterns to make sure that you're making the right choices, the best choices for for yourself, but the ones that have the best impact in your in our world generally.
And you've already committed to a follow-up program, which I am appreciative of. But Ms. Caitlin Welsh, Director of the Global Food Security Program at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, CSIS, thank you for taking the time to talk to us today and update us on what's happening with food insecurity, food security, both domestically and globally. Thank you for joining this program.
Likewise. Thank you so much, Ben. Thanks for having me.
And of course, thank you all who are watching along at home. Thank you for tuning in. Thank you to those watching a later broadcast. We appreciate that too. Whether you're watching live or you're watching a later broadcast, Caitlin, for folks looking to connect with you, follow the work that you and others are doing at CSIS, where can we point them to?
Thanks. To follow the food security program, you can find us on Twitter at CSIS Food. We have a great Twitter feed and encourage you to follow us.
Absolutely. They've got a great Twitter feed, great website as well. Plenty of different resources that Ms. Welsh referenced you can find on their website. And of course, for more information on both past and upcoming Jefferson Educational Society programming, as well as publications, please do visit our website at jeserie.org. And be sure to like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter and Instagram, and subscribe to our YouTube channel. For the Jefferson Educational Society, I'm Ben Spagan. Be safe, be sound, and thanks for listening and learning with us.